Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Fernando López de Castilla, founding partner at GNF Worldwide, and I have the pleasure of being this morning with my two good friends and talented colleagues from Bird & Bird, Melissa Murray and Lourdes Ayala. Melissa is from Bird & Bird's Dubai office, and Lourdes is from Bird & Bird Madrid's office. Do you want to introduce yourselves, ladies?
Thank you. I'm Melissa. I'm head of the Intellectual Property Department for Bird & Bird's Dubai offices. I focus on commercialisation of intellectual property, so very much looking at the franchising system and the way it works throughout all of the Middle East, but with a particular focus on the UAE and Saudi Arabia.
Lourdes?
Hi, thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Melissa, for being here. It's a pleasure to be here together with you. I'm the head of the corporate department in the Madrid office of Bird & Bird. We are focused on all kind of investments, and particularly in growing up international and national clients, whether in Spain or throughout the Europe particularly. And franchising and other hybrid structures are a bread and butter of how our clients want to grow, so we go with them together with GNF.
Thank you, Melissa and Lourdes. So, franchising, right? What a nice, huge topic. We could spend hours talking about it. We aren't going to do that, don't worry, guys. But what we are going to have is a very casual, a very nice conversation regarding franchising, in particularly in the UAE and in Spain. You know, lots of myths around it. You know, lots of questions we receive from our clients. Actually, the questions you will be hearing us today discuss have been submitted by clients of us in both markets. So this should be, you know, pretty down to earth, pretty pragmatic, you know, a pragmatic discussion. And the idea, of course, is to give you guys some value this morning. And thank you again for joining us. So let's start. So first question for both of you ladies, regarding the market. In general terms, how is the franchising industry? I'll start with you, Melissa. How is the franchising industry in the UAE? What do you consider to be the opportunities today?
So the franchising industry in the UAE is very strong. It always has been. The UAE is very hungry for international brands. They do like new concepts to be coming through because there's such a strong tourism industry. So the tourists really drive all of the new concepts that come into the UAE. In terms of the industry areas, it's usually restaurants, apparels and hotels. Those are the strongest markets that we're seeing with the files that we're working on at the moment. But I would also say the UAE also now has brought in tax. So I think there will be a demand for tax consultants and accountancy services and things like that. Those kind of service franchised brands that haven't necessarily been so strong in the UAE so far, but there will be demand and need for those coming up soon.
Awesome. What about you, Lourdes? What about Spain? How is the industry here in Spain? How is the market? What are the opportunities?
So I guess in part the same as Melissa was commenting. In Spain we see international brands coming in, particularly Latin America and US brands, and particularly also driven by tourism and restaurants and, you know, the good food in Spain and the good concepts. And we have a market that is open for new brands and concepts, as you well know, Fernando. I would say from our perspective, in a rather more legal concept, if you want, we see investors, institutional investors, supporting franchisees. So more and more, I would say the franchisee network is becoming more sophisticated, which is, I think, something that the industry is calling for or has been calling for a long time. So we see that starting to happen. I mean, it has happened in the past, but it's starting to happen more and more often. Don't know if you kind of share my views, Fernando, in Spain, but I think that's a fact.
Yes, 100%. I think it's very interesting, right? Because a lot of people, especially, clients from the US, maybe, or Latin America, of course, or even within Europe, they ask us about all the time, right? Hey, so how is the Spanish franchising industry, or how is Dubai? And many people, because they have come maybe to Madrid, to have some great wine and food, or they have gone to Dubai, to take pictures at the Burj Khalifa or Burj Khalaf, they believe they already understand the market, right? And the fact is that these are very complex markets. First of all, they are not, I think, and I hope you share my vision, they are not as sophisticated regarding franchising as they may appear, right? So there is a lot of gaps, a lot of opportunity, lack of know-how in general about the industry, So I think there is a lot of space for newcomers and also, for locals that want to do things right in both countries. Do you would agree with that?
Definitely. In the UAE, there's always plenty of opportunities for good quality brands. We've seen a number of lower tier brands coming into the region and they don't survive, mainly because either the franchisor hasn't given enough training or they really haven't focused on the UAE, because there's a large time difference and there's a long travel distance between the United States and the UAE. So if there are international brands that are looking at the UAE, they really need to invest. They need to remember it's a partnership. It's not just a random franchisee far on the other side of the world. So those franchisors who really have a sophisticated and strategic method of going into the market and really partnering with their franchisee, they're the ones that do really well. I mean, the most successful ones that I have seen is where the international brand sets up an office of their own and has their own staff helping the franchisee day to day. Because it's not good if your franchisee is calling you in the middle of the night because the point of sale system has gone down and no one's answering. And that happens a lot. That happens more than you would realise. That the franchisee, they need support. They need to work together. It is a partnership. And so those brands that really focus on it and are successful are the ones that really, they work together as a partner with their franchisee.
100%. And we'll discuss, more in a bit the opportunities, because there are so many that we could just spend, the whole hour talking about opportunities. The second question is about regulation. So what are the legal requirements for negotiating and establishing a franchise in the UAE, Melissa? And are there any specific regulations, and what are the key limitations or restrictions about it?
So the UAE is quite a free market in terms of franchising. We don't have a specific franchise regulation, which is good and bad. So it's good in that we don't have a disclosure regime, so it can be quite quick to negotiate a franchise deal. But we do have surrounding laws such as the consumer protection legislation, IP regulations, and we do have a commercial agency law that need to be considered. So you do need to get local legal advice to make sure that your documents are compliant with local law and that you can enforce your agreement with the franchisee if things aren't going well. But that said, it can be much quicker for the lawyers to negotiate a deal than a country like Saudi Arabia, where they've got a very strict franchise law which has a very strict disclosure regime and documents need to be in the Arabic language. In the UAE we don't have that, so it can be quite easy to negotiate the legal terms, but at the same time there's a lot of surrounding laws that need to be considered when you're entering into the contractual relationship.
Right. What about Spain, Lourdes?
Yeah, in Spain, well, first of all, the same, the surrounding regulations that Melissa was talking about is the same, or even, and as you know, these surrounding laws, that the good part of it is that most of them are harmonized throughout the European Union. So if you are entering into Europe through Spain, which is quite common for in a lot of cases from Latin American brands, for example, whenever you comply with those type of laws in Spain, you're complying throughout Europe. I'm talking about labeling, consumer protection, IP. We will enter into details if you want. But from the perspective of the purely franchise regulation, the contract is what we call atypic, which means it's not really regulated in its content, but it's regulated formally in the sense of a disclosure obligation, which is very important to comply with because it can damage the validity of the contract if it's formally not compliant. That means the franchisor needs to disclose certain essential description, I would say, of the franchise network and the franchise contract and the IP around that's put at the disposal of the franchisee with a certain period of time in advance, which is 20 days, basically to protect the franchisee. Basically the underlying rationale is the franchisee is the weak part, quote unquote, and needs to be made aware of the concept that it's acquiring, and that's done through the disclosure.
Right, and regulation is such a strong word, right? Like it's almost scary, right? when clients, being the franchisors or the candidates to be franchisees, they hear the word regulation, they just freak out, right? It's a strong word, but I think that the truth of the matter is, as long as you follow the rules, you do your homework, and you surround with professional advisors and help, I mean, that's pretty much it, right? Like many times, and it happens this a lot in Spain, mostly actually, a lot of people, they just don't like the word franchising. And when we introduce opportunities, for example, in the US or in Latin America or even the Middle East, they will say, but this other brand which is 20 times bigger than us or 200 times bigger than us, they try that market and they fail, so I'm the little guy. But they went there like cowboys, right? So I mean, they were not going to be successful ever. Right?
Yeah.
So would you agree that it's more about any specific market or even about the system itself? It's just about doing your homework and surrounding yourself with professional people?
100%. I have seen some what we would call much smaller brands be very, very successful because they've got that it factor. They've got something that's new and innovative, but also, again, like I said before, the franchisor very much treats it like a partnership. It's almost a joint venture. I mean, it's not fully a joint venture, obviously, in that the franchisor isn't putting in share capital. But when the franchisor is fully invested in the franchisee's success, then everybody wins. The ones you can tell the franchisors that are trying to just get the upfront fee or a royalty stream, and they're only focused on it for a few years, maybe because they've got private equity funding and that they want to get out in a few years. You can feel that in the negotiations with the things that they care about and the things they don't care about. There are some negotiations that we do, and when the franchisor is very concerned about brand standards, quality of food, making sure the outlets look great, that they're fully invested in the brand. They want the brand to succeed worldwide. They're not in it for a quick buck. And unfortunately, especially in the Middle East, we do see some franchisors who are trying to be opportunistic to just get that initial fee and then not really too worried about the long-term play. But a franchise relationship, they are long-term contracts. They're usually 10 years plus 10 years plus 10-year renewals. We work on some franchise deals that have been going for 50 years, and those are the ones that really succeed because both parties really want the brand to succeed and they want that to continue long term.
Awesome.
Completely agree. I think one thing that Melissa mentioned that I believe is critical is the ones that we've seen more successful and growing on a steady but strong way are the ones that have opened up here and that have really taken care of the commercial and technical assistance in a serious way and looking. I mean, it's an in the middle thing, right? Because you cannot enter too much into the business of the franchisee, from a liability perspective. But on the other hand, you need to partner with your franchisee network. So absolutely agree. Yes.
Yes. And at the end of the day, and I always say this: if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys, right? I mean, that's the truth of the matter, right? So yes, franchising is not easy. International franchising is definitely not easier, but so just don't put yourself more hurdles in the way, So get the best help you can get or you can buy, basically. Agree? Okay. Next topic, IP, which is, of course, you guys will feel very, very comfortable in this. So regarding IP, how are intellectual property rights protected in the case of the UAE, Melissa? And if are any cases worth mentioning?
So intellectual property is very much respected in the Middle East. It's very important for franchisors when they're looking at coming into the Middle East to make sure that they register their trademarks. Both UAE and Saudi and most Middle East countries are first to file regimes. So it's very important that you get on the register first. So what that means is if you are exhibiting in Middle East franchise exhibitions or any international exhibitions and you're approached by people from the Middle East, you really need to make sure that you get your trademark registered early and at least get your application in. It can take a few months for the registration to go through, so you don't want to be signing up a franchise deal and you don't actually own the trademark yet. So we have had in the past a number of cases where mainly American brands have come to the Middle East and someone already else has their trademark, so they can't actually sign a franchise deal. They have to come up with either a secondary brand or buy out the person who has got their trademark. So it can be very important to make sure that you actually own the trademark that you're trying to license. Also because we do have cultural considerations. So there are some brands where we might say to them, this isn't going to fly in the Middle East, you need to change things. So we've had logos be tailored, certain names be tailored. In Arabic, the name might mean something not great or something a bit funny, and so we have made sure, we've worked with the brands to make sure that they're getting the correct protection for their name and that the name doesn't come across in the wrong way.
Right, thank you, Melissa. Lourdes, what about Spain?
Yeah, well, in Spain, what we would normally recommend the brands to do is to register throughout Europe because it's a sole, one whole territory for the purposes of the brand. So that's what we would normally recommend. It's, of course, the cultural issue is not that important, or there's not such a big gap, but of course it applies what Melissa told, just explain about the registration is very important. It's very critical to have priority and not to be later on facing that you have to buy someone that may kind of blackmail. So that's critical. In terms of other IP rights that may be very important, more so maybe for the services than for restaurants maybe, but the trade secrets, well, and for restaurants also, for the formulas and other kind of unregistered IP rights are very important. So what we would normally recommend is to establish a trade secret protocol. And I would have loved that my colleagues specialized in IP would come and we could elaborate more. But that's what they do on a day-to-day basis. So it's important also, and we sometimes forget about how important to protect the know-how / trade secrets for a franchise is.
Right, and IP is, that's franchising 101, right? Yeah. That's it's one of the first questions we ask, right? How much are your sales per month? How many people you have? Where is your brand trademark, right? So that's basically franchising 101, right? We have had some cases in which we realized, of course, not anymore, but many years ago, cases in where we discovered that a brand was not fully registered in a country while we were actually already reviewing the franchise agreement with a candidate, right? So that's just something very basic that shouldn't be a problem, in the course of the ongoing development. Yes. Okay. Let's get away from IP. What about investment? An investment, of course, can enclose a huge variety of topics and discussions. But in terms of investment, what should we consider in our business model for franchising in the UAE, Melissa? And in terms of its financial disclosure process. So what about investment in general within the franchising industry? And on the other hand, what about the financial disclosure process for the UAE?
So the UAE doesn't have a disclosure regime. So you don't need to, the franchisor doesn't need to complete a disclosure document to explain to the franchisee what the investment will be. The UAE is a very different market in that the majority of franchising happens with very sophisticated franchisees. We have a lot of very large families who hold multiple brands, and sometimes the franchisee is much larger than the franchisor. So the franchisee is obviously the best person to know what the rent is, what the staff costs are, what the overheads are going to be. The UAE also is very different from some other markets in that our rent is very high compared to other markets, but our corporate tax is a lot lower than in other countries. We only just brought in corporate tax this year, so this is something new that both franchisors and franchisees are working out. We do have a VAT, but then our labour and staff costs can be lower than many other countries. So it's a very different market. And also in the UAE, a lot of the brands are going into the shopping malls, and the shopping malls, the rent can be quite high comparative. We don't have a lot of, high street locations just because logistically the heat. So a lot of locations are looking at shopping malls. The shopping malls are going to have higher rent depending on where they're located. So it can be a very different market. So you really need to work with your franchisee around the costs and the expenses that the franchisee might incur, but it's very different from other markets.
Agree. Lourdes, what about Spain?
Yeah, it's quite different. In fact, in Spain, we find, generally speaking, the franchisor is bigger or more sophisticated than the franchisee. That changes, of course, and there are some quite big and professional chains that have a lot of brands as franchisees, but that's not normal. And from the regulation perspective, that's definitely not considered as the rule. As I was saying before, is that the franchisee is the one that needs to be protected, and particularly in relation to investment. So in a franchisee disclosure document does include as a particular point of very critical point, in fact, is what the investment is necessary for setting up a location. That doesn't mean, of course, that doesn't mean that needs to be certain to the euro, or that if it's bigger than expected, there's a liability. There's any liability on the side of the franchisor, but you need to be very transparent, and this investment needs to be based on experience. And if, for example, there may be a difference in rent from another market, it needs to be disclosed also. Okay, you need to check, you need to make aware, the franchisee aware that he needs to do their homework or his homework, etc. So it needs to be very transparent. So that's for the investment side. In relation to the forecasts, they don't need, it's not something that you need to disclose. Sometimes, we all the time see that there is a temptation on the side of the franchisor to share forecast, which is logical, but they need to be shared, if they are shared, with all caveats that this is not a promise, this is not something that, that you can expect, but it's not guaranteed, of course. It's your own business. And if disclosed, the law says that it needs to be grounded, certainly grounded on experience. So, the tag probably is be very careful when sharing that, and of course, sell your business, but make sure that that is understood in the context of where and what you're sharing.
Right. So regarding the disclosure process, I mean, Spain and the UAE is not the US or Canada, right?
No.
Correct.
So I mean, we can be very, very flexible, not less rigorous, but for sure much more, way more creative and flexible in how we sell or promote our business, right? So yes, that's one thing definitely. On the other hand, regarding investment is a big word, right? Of course, depending if you are the franchisor or the franchisee, the word means a totally different thing, right? But and if you are a candidate, an investor or a group or a private equity or whatever kind of entity looking to acquire a franchise right for the UAE or Spain, of course, if the franchisor is a mom and pop or a huge chain or a multi-brand, multi-sector private equity, of course, the dynamic is completely different and the numbers are very different as well, right? And actually, we work with brands from where they are very, very little until they are very, very big. And investment is a big word. And I think that my last comment regarding this topic at this point would be just understand the numbers of the deal and the development you are getting in. Because sometimes, how much is, you need to open this store? 150,000 euros. Oh, great, that's it. No, that's not it. No. That's just the tip of the iceberg, right? So there is a lot of things to consider, even, of course, for a single unit, but when you are negotiating multi-unit deals or even master deals or area development, this work actually gets a whole total dimension, right?
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is something when I'm working with smaller brands that I talk about is the franchisor doing due diligence on the franchisee, because the franchisee sometimes they go into these deals not realizing how big an investment it is, not realizing that maybe they will be able to afford rent in a certain location, but it's not the best location, and then it's not going to work anyway. So I tell franchisees to make sure they do due diligence on the franchisor, especially in the UAE where we don't have a disclosure law. So there's no disclosure coming from the franchisor about their history or the background. So the franchisee needs to do the due diligence on the franchisor, but the franchisor also should be doing that due diligence on the franchisee to make sure that the franchisee can actually afford this and is really into it. I mean, I have had a few times with smaller brands where the franchisee can only afford to open one.
Right.
They've got a development plan for 5, but they cannot afford 5. And it's a shame because obviously everybody is planning their back office systems, especially the franchisor, based on 5 outlets going forward.
Right. And we are not saying, to completely know your counterpart, you can be married for 50 years and still you don't know your wife. That's a joke. It's a joke. Someone said that you just know your partner when you divorce, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, so of course, you aren't gonna get to know truly, your franchisor, your franchisee within a 3 or 6 months due diligence process, but at least do your homework and get the basics, right?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And I think that's why, Fernando, you mentioned it before. I think that is why I really believe a good advisor enters into place, and GNF is someone that can help doing that, not only legal, of course, but economical, and more than the economic situation itself, as Melissa was saying, the capacity there to understand the complexity of a deal that may be difficult and that is completely different, of course, if it's a master or a development agreement or a multi-unit deal.
Yes, 100% Lourdes. Thank
Just,
you. Okay, let's move on. What about controversies? So this is also, very, very sassy topic. Melissa, how are legal disputes between a franchisor and a franchisee usually handled and resolved, hopefully, in the UAE? Any cases worth mentioning?
So in the UAE, it is very rare for the parties to go to court. Most of the deals have the dispute resolution process as an arbitration clause. So that means we don't see what is going on, but I would say arbitration is expensive, so in a way it incentivizes the parties to resolve the issue before going to arbitration. It is very rare for mediation to occur. I know, like in Australia, mediation is a very strong system of resolving disputes in franchise relationships, and there are very sophisticated mediation centres for franchising, and it's very successful. It's just not done in the Middle East. It's not a concept really. It's beginning to come in. I know the Dubai Legal Affairs Department are beginning to bring in a mediation centre, and they're running a course for mediators, but at the moment mediation isn't a strong way of resolving disputes. So very much the parties will go to arbitration if it gets that far, because it is expensive. Most of the time people are resolving the dispute between themselves. Sometimes as lawyers we get involved and say, it's not going to be worth the money going to arbitration on this, so let's negotiate and work it out. The UAE, and all of the Middle East countries, we have a very strong concept of good faith, and that's across all of the Middle East countries, and it's very much embedded in our civil and commercial codes. So even in terms of a dispute, everybody has to act in good faith. Now, obviously, under English law, there's lots of case law about what does good faith mean, but from a Middle East perspective, it really is just trying to resolve the dispute, taking into consideration both parties' situation, and then how can you resolve this for the benefit of both parties. So quite often when I have an international brand coming to me and they're saying, look, this isn't going to work out, we want to terminate, I often say to them, well, when is the franchisee's lease up? Is now the right time to be terminating? If they've got 6 months left, let's talk to them, let's give them a 6-month wind down period, let's let them finish their rent so that they're not in default with their landlords, that they're not incurring extra costs, that we're going to try and mitigate their losses so that we can have a friendly departure without it turning really nasty, basically.
That would be nice, right?
We try.
Lourdes?
No, I think it's quite similar in another context, but quite similar in the sense that the parties, and this is not only for franchise agreements, but for long-term commercial contracts generally, or partnerships that we see all the time. Parties generally reach amicable solutions. It's either through informal negotiations, which is more common also in Spain, but also through what we call ADR, alternative dispute resolutions. Mediation is becoming more and more, it's becoming stronger, but anyhow, most of the cases come to an amicable solution because, among other things, because in Spain, litigation is very slow, or quite slow. So, unless, you try to reach an agreement, and so I think it's like less than 1% of in terms of locations. The litigation ratio is lower than 1%. I think it's around 0 point something. So it's very, very low. Normally the litigations that we see more are coming from breach of contract, more in terms of non-compete or royalty,
right.
Unpaid royalties. What we would normally see is a counterclaim from the franchisee, and basically attacking the validity of the contract, normally in relation to know-how, or, I mean, if it's not very obvious that there is a problem with the trademark, of course, but if there's no any particular problem, it's know-how or the breach of contract because of lack of support on the commercial or technical assistance that the franchisor needs to deliver. Those are the main conflicts that we see, I think.
Right, and I don't want to get too much into this because we have a lot more of very, very cool and happier topics.
Yes.
But yes, and I always compare the franchisor-franchisee relationship to a marriage, and I'm a happily married man, okay? But the truth of the matter is that in any franchisor-franchisee relationship, I mean, it acts a lot like a marriage. Like first you're in love, and everything is pretty, everything is pink, you know, and happy. But then, of course, crises come, right? So you have, you know, to sort them out.
Yeah.
And if in one of those crises, you just, you know, you freak out or you get to a point of controversy, the idea is just to minimize harm, as you ladies said, right? Because at the end of the day, if you fight, nobody wins. That's the truth of it, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, happier topics. What about competition? And here, Melissa, I would ask you if you could also talk a little bit more about even the GCC and especially maybe Saudi Arabia, which is a market you know that we are all of us are very fond of.
Yes.
So regarding competition, how are competition laws handled in the franchise sector in the UAE and in KSA? And what about non-compete clauses in an agreement? And finally, how competitive are these markets, Melissa, the GCC, but in particular the UAE and KSA?
Okay, so the UAE is quite competitive. We do have a lot of restaurant brands, and we do have a lot of clothing brands, and a lot of hotels. So I would say, but the UAE is always hungry for new concepts and new brands and new sexy things that can help the tourism industry. Compare that to Saudi Arabia, which is very much in a growth phase right now. So they are hungry for all types of concepts, all types of restaurants, from the salad bars all the way up to the very high end. They are hungry for lots of different concepts. So I would say that Saudi is very much a greenfield site. So I would say there's a lot more opportunities there. I think the UAE, you have to be quite niche and specific and really have something that's new, a very new concept or something that's very different to what we already have. Because we do have some very successful brands already in the UAE. In terms of non-compete clauses in contracts, it's very common for the families, like I said before, that hold multiple brands. So you have to be very careful in your contract, because some big families, they might have a salad bar, a burger chain, a pizza chain. So it's very hard for the lawyers to say, okay, you need to only run my food restaurant, you're not allowed any other food restaurants, because of course the families are going to say, well, no, I already have this brand and this brand and this brand. So when we do the non-compete clauses, we're very careful, and we usually list out and say, these are who we consider to be our competitors. We carve out any existing brands that they already have, and then we say to them, you need to be careful about cross-contamination in terms of confidential information, because some of the big franchisees, they hire thousands of staff, and we have had in the past franchisees who they have a chef from one brand, and then the chef in the other brand is sick that day. Oh, I'll just move this chef over. And you're like, well, hang on, this chef who is specialised in a Chinese restaurant should not be working in the pizza chain, and he hasn't been trained, and he doesn't know how our system works. So you shouldn't be doing that, franchisee. So we're a bit careful with some of the clauses around the operations and the training, but also when it comes to the recipes and the training and the know-how. So I have worked on some deals where franchisees have come and said, I want a central kitchen the lettuce and the tomato because I use those same ingredients across it all. And that's okay. We've got no problems with that. But when you start getting to the special sauces and the special spices, that's a problem because you don't want your special sauce being used in another brand. So we have to be very careful around the clauses that we put in around the non-compete and the protection of know-how and IP, but also cross-contamination of brands, especially when you're working with some of the master franchisees in the region who have multiple brands running at the one time.
Awesome, thank you. Lourdes, what about Spain?
I think, the market is completely different. So we may face those type of questions that Melissa was saying in a much smaller degree. I think what we see more is the restrict. I mean, we can establish non-compete clauses, of course, for the post-contractual. So the complexity is more around the post-contractual non-compete clause. There is restrictions coming from the European Union, which is, basically a little bit more limited than the franchisor would want, because generally speaking, it's only related to the location itself and very limited. Sometimes we have found quite often a breach of contract, a termination of the franchise agreement, and setting up a new location very similar, very close. And that is something that happens. So that's, it's kind of where we see more difficulties in that respect. And in terms of competition, I mean, you know more than me, Fernando, I think, how competitive it is, or how we, what type of market we have in that respect. But yes, so competition is a problem in a lot of cases. It's one of the most common breaches, in fact.
Yeah, so I mean, big question, big topic, So Spain, on the one hand, a lot of Spanish clients tell me, hey, Fernando, but in Spain, we are so competitive, there is no room for anything. And I'm like, you should get out of the country a little more, That it's not that competitive, right? So you have a lot of offering, but it's not as competitive, or competition is not as sophisticated as it's getting, or it will get in 3, 4, 5, 10 years, That's one thing. The GCC, of course, whole different world. I think it's very important to understand more even than the similarities, the difference between the UAE and KSA, right? So when you go to the UAE, of course, it's like Disneyland, right? But behind all that bling bling and that, that magic, actually, the Emiratis, they have, a ton of international brands, but I think they have failed to develop their local industry, their domestic industry, So it's very hard to find highly successful big Emiratis chains or Emiratis brands, right? On the other hand, when you go to KSA, you find 20, 100, 300, 600 unit Saudi brands, So completely different market. Of course, they are very hungry, for global brands, but it's key to understand what competition means in the UAE, what competition means in KSA, and of course, what competition means in Spain, right?
100%.
Now, we have just about 10 minutes left, 11 minutes left, so I'm just gonna, erase the more boring topics, so we aren't gonna talk about imports or labor or supply or royalties, but we are gonna get just in a couple more topics which I think they are very, very valuable, because the audience is just not going to be able to Google this, right? So this is more, you come from our experience, our track records, and of course, the organizations we are part of. So one topic I really want to discuss with you ladies is, and we can mix, a couple of them. One is culture. How big is culture when dealing, with the things we deal? And how does negotiation comes with culture? I mean, how different it is, because part of this is, the audience to understand. So if I'm a Spanish brand and I want to go to the GCC, to the UAE, to KSA, or I am, a brand from the Middle East and I want to go into Europe, Spain, or from Latin America, or the US, same thing, So how big is culture, and how does a negotiation process usually flows when dealing with intercultural parties and intercultural counterparts?
Yeah, it's very interesting because in the UAE we have a very large population of expats. So it's important to work out who you're negotiating with. Is that a local family, but has the local family hired Western expats to negotiate the deal on their behalf? Or are you negotiating with the owners directly? And I would say every deal is different. So I have had some Saudi deals and UAE deals where we've been negotiating with local Arabs, and part of the culture is that they really want to get to know you well. They are really wanting to make sure that this is going to succeed. So at the beginning, the negotiations can go quite slow because there's a lot of face-to-face meetings. They really want to know that they can trust you and that you're going to be invested in the relationship. Then I've had some deals where it might be Westerners who are negotiating the deal, and it can go very fast. It can be a very corporate transaction, and it's very much they send us the term sheet, we send them a draft back, they amend it, send it back, and it's all done within a month. So it's very much, I've had some deals go what would we consider to be very slow because everyone's getting to know each other very well. They're doing proper due diligence on each side. And then I've had some corporate deals that go very, very fast. So I would say that there's no one size fits all. But also, I have had some brands that have come from overseas, and for example, some chicken brands and sort of curry brands, and the spice, the tastes in the Middle East go towards more spicy and hotter products. So they've changed their brand. They've gotten rid of some products and obviously focused more on others. Also, we do have cultural restrictions, so obviously alcohol is restricted. In Saudi, there's no alcohol, so if you're a restaurant brand and you heavily rely on alcohol sales, it's not necessarily going to be the best place to go just yet. The UAE, there's no problems there. But also pork products, so if your product is very heavily reliant on pork products, then maybe that's not the best concept to be coming to the Middle East. So there's a lot of different cultural considerations in both how we negotiate the deal, but also the concept and what are you trying to sell in the Middle East.
Awesome, Melissa, thank you. Lourdes?
No, I think it's a great question, Fernando. I think as lawyers I tend to think our main value added when negotiating a deal is precisely intercultural experience and helping the clients and the other party to understand each other and bridge these cultural differences. And that's precisely, I think, what we best do, because in a lot of cases, the cultural difference may be a deal breaker. That's for sure. So what do we find? I mean, of course, culture gaps. For example, Latin American are more formal than Spanish. Spanish are very direct when negotiating and very may get even quote unquote aggressive if you don't know it. French people, they tend to be much more calm down, and if you go with that like direct way to talk, they may get offended, etc. Right? Not to talk about UK, etc. So what we find, of course, is Europe is a whole world. It's not the same culture across Europe, of course, and that is very important. So what I would say is what's most important in Spain, at least, is manage expectations. You have to manage expectations of the other party. That, for example, from a legal perspective, is very important in terms of how thick the contract is. If you are in front of a not so sophisticated counterparty, you may want to thin down a little bit your contract, and that's pretty important. Or if it's thick, you have to explain, well, this is a template, I'm not trying to offend anyone, I'm not. So those type of things are become very, very important when negotiating.
Yes, I mean, big topics. Actually, and the third and last topic I'm going just to include in my take on this is territoriality. Yes. So culture is a huge topic, and by the way, very little and poorly addressed within international franchising. It's amazing, It's in an industry that succeeds in cross-border and scaling ventures. Nobody talks about culture, right? So culture gaps, culture distance within the parties are huge. Even more important of how cool is your brand, or how professional is your system, or how much money or bandwidth the other side has. Is, hey, are you managing also the expectations within the culture, and if you actually understand each other, I don't want to get again into the marriage thing, but
but it's true.
Message sent is not necessarily message received, right?
Yeah.
So when you first of all negotiation, any negotiation is a process, right? And you negotiate even when you don't think you are negotiating, right? So a lot of clients tell me, yes, now I want your help, guys, because I've been, talking with this candidate, but don't worry, I haven't negotiated anything because we haven't gotten to the negotiation table. And I'm like, okay, my friend. First of all, this is going to be very expensive for you. Second, there is usually now negotiation table. You negotiate. Every word you say, standing, eating, drinking, telling a joke, you are basically negotiating. So not being aware of that can be very, very expensive for you. That's one thing. A negotiation, of course, is a process. You have to understand your BADNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. You have to understand what's important to the other party and what's important to you. You have to understand more the differences, so that you don't get into a sum-zero game. You have to understand, what are the main differences, even more than what both parties want. And culture is even, of course, if you don't know the country or the market, it's like in the old days, when some franchisors would give a master franchise right for the Middle East, like what's that, or for Latin America, or for the US. So that's just today in today's world.
Yes.
That's just crazy, right? Yeah. So of course you have to understand the geography, you have to understand the country, but you have to be very sensitive, culturally speaking, and you have to have cultural intelligence.
Yes.
And this is a topic we could just spend a whole new webinar talking about, but since we don't have more time today, final comments on this and on everything we have discussed. Melissa, please.
Yeah, I would just say for the Middle East, it is very important to get advisors that have had experience in the region. I've been there for 18 years now. I feel like I've learned a lot about how it all works in different countries. But also, like you said before, the Middle East is not just one area. There's so many different cultures. Different countries are at different growth rates. You've got a lot of countries that are focusing on tourism and development, and then are focusing on so many different areas. I mean, Saudi has been doing in the last few years is just simply phenomenal. That we have so many Saudi deals going on, and they've got really great support for international brands coming in, and they really want that international experience. The UAE is very competitive in terms of tourism, so they're a very sophisticated market. Ease of doing business is fantastic, so it's a good place to start if you're an international brand and you want exposure to the Middle East region. The UAE's always been a great place to go. I think we've talked about a lot, but there's always much more that we can talk about.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Lourdes?
No, just, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for sharing this table. It's been a pleasure. And I think, this is just a sample of the complexities of the culture, of the complexities of the and of the system, and at the same time of the simplicity that Melissa was saying. When you have experience and you're together with someone that can help, it's really different, and you can avoid a lot of issues, anticipating yourself in what to come.
So thank you very much, Melissa, Lourdes.
you.
Thank you all, and